The Man in the Brown Suit by Agatha Christie. Chapter 22. Extract from the Diary of Sir Eustace Pedlar. I am inclined to abandon my reminiscences. Instead, I shall write a short article entitled Secretaries I Have Had. As regards secretaries, I seem to have fallen under a blight. At one minute I have no secretaries, at another I have too many. At the present minute I am journeying to Rhodesia with a pack of women. Race goes off with the two best looking, of course, and leaves me with the dud. That is what always happens to me, and, after all, this is my private car, not Race's. Also, and Bedingfeld is accompanying me to Rhodesia on the pretext of being my temporary secretary. But all this afternoon she has been out on the observation platform with Race exclaiming at the beauty of the Hex River Pass. It is true that I told her her principal duty would be to hold my hand. But she isn't even doing that. Perhaps she is afraid of Miss Pettigrew. I don't blame her if so. There is nothing attractive about Miss Pettigrew. She is a repellent female with large feet, more like a man than a woman. There is something very mysterious about Anne Bedingfeld. She jumped on board the train at the last minute, puffing like a steam engine for all the world as though she'd been running a race, and yet Paget told me that he'd seen her off to Durban last night. Either Paget has been drinking again or else the girl must have an astral body. And she never explains. Nobody ever explains. Yes, secretaries I have had. Number 1, a murderer fleeing from justice. Number 2, a secret drinker who carries on disreputable intrigues in Italy. Number 3, a beautiful girl who possesses the useful faculty of being in two places at once. Number 4, Miss Pettigrew, who, I have no doubt, is really a particularly dangerous crook in disguise. Probably one of Paget's Italian friends that he has palmed off on me. I shouldn't wonder if the world found some day that it had been grossly deceived by Paget. On the whole, I think Rayburn was the best of the bunch. He never worried me or got in my way. Guy Paget has had the impertinence to have the stationery trunk put in here. None of us can move without falling over it. I went out on the observation platform just now, expecting my appearance to be greeted with hails of delight. Both the women were listening spellbound to one of Race's traveller's tales. I shall label this car, not Sir Eustace Pedlar and Party, but Colonel Ray's and Harem. Then Mrs. Blair must needs begin taking silly photographs. Every time we went round a particularly appalling curve, as we climbed higher and higher, she snapped at the engine. You see the point, she cried delightedly. It must be some curve if you can photograph the front part of the train from the back, and with the mountain background it will look awfully dangerous. I pointed out to her that no one could possibly tell it had been taken from the back of the train. She looked at me pityingly. I shall write underneath it, taken from the train. Engine going round a curve. You could write that under any snapshot of a train, I said. Women never think of these simple things. I'm glad we've come up here in daylight, cried Anne Bedingfeld. I shouldn't have seen this if I'd gone last night to Durban, should I? No, said Colonel Ray's, smiling. You'd have waked up tomorrow morning to find yourself in the Karoo, a hot, dusty desert of stones and rocks. I'm glad I changed my mind, said Anne, sighing contentedly and looking round. It was rather a wonderful sight. The great mountains all around, through which we turned and twisted and labored ever steadily upwards. Is this the best train in the day to Rhodesia? Asked Anne Bedingfeld. In the day, laughed Race. Why, my dear Miss Anne, there are only 3 trains a week. Mondays, Wednesdays and Saturdays. Do you realize that you don't arrive at the falls until Saturday next? How well we shall know each other by that time, said Mrs. Blair maliciously. How long are you going to stay at the falls, Sir Eustace? That depends, I said cautiously. On what? On how things go at Johannesburg. My original idea was to stay a couple of days or so at the falls, which I've never seen, though this is my third visit to Africa, and then go on to Joburg and study the conditions of things on the Rand. At home, you know, I pose as being an authority on South African politics. But from all I hear, Joburg will be a particularly unpleasant place to visit in about a week's time. I don't want to study conditions in the midst of a ragging revolution. Ray smiled in a rather superior manner. I think your fears are exaggerated, Sir Eustace. There will be no great danger in Joburg. The women immediately looked at him in the "what a brave hero you are" manner. It annoyed me intensely. I am every bit as brave as Ray's, but I lack the figure. These long, lean, brown men have it all their own way. I suppose you'll be there, I said coldly. Very possibly. We might travel together. I'm not sure that I shan't stay on at the falls a bit, I answered non-committally. Why is Ray so anxious that I should go to Joburg? He's got his eye on Anne, I believe. What are your plans, Miss Anne? That depends, she replied demurely, copying me. I thought you were my secretary, I objected. Oh, but I've been cut out. You've been holding Miss Pettigrew's hand all the afternoon. Whatever I've been doing, I can swear I've not been doing that, I assured her. Thursday night. We have just left Kimberley. Race was made to tell the story of the diamond robbery all over again. Why are women so excited by anything to do with diamonds? At last, Anne Bedingfeld has shed her veil of mystery. It seems that she's a newspaper correspondent. She sent an immense cable from DR this morning. To judge by the jabbering that went on nearly all night in Mrs. Blair's cabin, she must have been reading aloud all her special articles for years to come. It seems that all along she's been on the track of the man in the brown suit. Apparently she didn't spot him on the Kilmorden. In fact, she hardly had the chance, but she's now very busy cabling home how I journeyed out with the murderer and inventing highly fictitious stories of what he said to me, etc. I know how these things are done. I do them myself, in my reminiscences when Paget will let me. And of course one of Nasby's efficient staff will brighten up the details still more, so that when it appears in the daily budget Rayburn won't recognize himself. The girl's clever, though. All on her own, apparently, she's ferreted out the identity of the woman who was killed in my house. She was a Russian dancer called Nadina. I asked Anne Bedingfeld if she was sure of this. She replied that it was merely a deduction, quite in the Sherlock Holmes manner. However, I gather that she had cabled it home to Nasby as a proved fact. Women have these intuitions. I've no doubt that Anne Bedingfeld is perfectly right in her guess, but to call it a deduction is absurd. How she ever got on the staff of the Daily Budget is more than I can imagine. But she is the kind of young woman who does these things. Impossible to withstand her. She is full of coaxing ways that mask an invincible determination. Look how she has got into my private car. I am beginning to have an inkling why. Ray said something about the police suspecting that Rayburn would make for Rhodesia. He might just have got off by Monday's train. They telegraphed all along the line, I presume, and no one of his description was found, but that says little. He's an astute young man and he knows Africa. He's probably exquisitely disguised as an old Kafir woman, and the simple police continue to look for a handsome young man with a scar, dressed in the height of European fashion. I never did quite swallow that scar. Anyway, and Bedingfeld is on his track. She wants the glory of discovering him for herself and the daily budget. Young women are very cold blooded nowadays. I hinted to her that it was an unwomanly action. She laughed at me. She assured me that did she run him to earth, her fortune was made. Reyes doesn't like it, either, I can see. Perhaps Rayburn is on this train. If so, we may all be murdered in our beds. I said so to Mrs. Blair, but she seemed quite to welcome the idea, and remarked that if I were murdered it would be really a terrific scoop for Anne. A scoop for Anne indeed. Tomorrow we shall be going through Bechuanaland. The dust will be atrocious. Also at every station, little Kafir children come and sell you quaint wooden animals that they carve themselves. Also mealy bowls and baskets. I am rather afraid that Mrs. Blair may run amok. There is a primitive charm about these toys that I feel will appeal to her. Friday evening. As I feared, Mrs. Blair and Anne have bought 49 wooden animals. Chapter 23. Anne's narrative resumed. I thoroughly enjoyed the journey up to Rhodesia. There was something new and exciting to see every day. First, the wonderful scenery of the Hex River Valley, then the desolate grandeur of the Karoo, and finally that wonderful straight stretch of line in Bechuanaland, and the perfectly adorable toys the natives brought to sell. Suzanne and I were nearly left behind at each station, if you could call them stations. It seemed to me that the train just stopped whenever it felt like it, and no sooner had it done so than a horde of natives materialized out of the empty landscape, holding up mealy bowls and sugar canes and fur carrosses and adorable carved wooden animals. Suzanne began at once to make a collection of the latter. I imitated her example. Most of them cost a tikkie, 3 pence, and each was different. There were giraffes and tigers and snakes and a melancholy-looking eland and absurd little black warriors. We enjoyed ourselves enormously. Sir Eustace tried to restrain us, but in vain. I still think it was a miracle we were not left behind at some oasis of the line. South African trains don't hoot or get excited when they are going to start off again. They just glide quietly away, and you look up from your bargaining and run for your life. Suzanne's amazement at seeing me climb upon the train at Cape Town can be imagined. We held an exhaustive survey of the situation on the first evening out. We talked half the night. It had become clear to me that defensive tactics must be adopted as well as aggressive ones. Traveling with Sir Eustace Pedler and his party, I was fairly safe. Both he and Colonel Reyes were powerful protectors, and I judged that my enemies would not wish to stir up a hornet's nest about my ears. Also, as long as I was near Sir Eustace, I was more or less in touch with Guy Paget, and Guy Paget was the heart of the mystery. I asked Suzanne whether in her opinion it was possible that Paget himself was the mysterious colonel. His subordinate position was, of course, against the assumption, but it had struck me once or twice that, for all his autocratic ways, Sir Eustace was really very much influenced by his secretary. He was an easygoing man, and one whom an adroit secretary might be able to twist round his little finger. The comparative obscurity of his position might in reality be useful to him, since he would be anxious to be well out of the limelight. Suzanne, however, negatived these ideas very strongly. She refused to believe that Guy Paget was the ruling spirit. The real head, the colonel, was somewhere in the background and had probably been already in Africa at the time of our arrival. I agreed that there was much to be said for her view, but I was not entirely satisfied. For in each suspicious instance Paget had been shown as the directing genius. It was true that his personality seemed to lack the assurance and decision that one would expect from a master criminal, but after all, according to Colonel Reyes, it was brain work only that this mysterious leader supplied, and creative genius is often allied to a weak and timorous physical constitution. There speaks the professor's daughter, interrupted Suzanne, when I had got to this point in my argument. It's true, all the same. On the other hand, Paget may be the Grand Vizier, so to speak, of the all highest. I was silent for a minute or two, and then went on musingly, I wish I knew how Sir Eustace made his money. Suspecting him again? Suzanne, I've got into that state that I can't help suspecting somebody. I don't really suspect him, but, after all, he is Paget's employer, and he did own the mill house. I've always heard that he made his money in some way he isn't anxious to talk about, said Suzanne thoughtfully. But that doesn't necessarily mean crime. It might be tin tax or hair restorer. I agreed ruefully. I suppose, said Suzanne doubtfully, that we are not barking up the wrong tree? Being led completely astray, I mean, by assuming Paget's complicity? Supposing that, after all, he is a perfectly honest man. I considered that for a minute or two, then I shook my head. I can't believe that. After all, he has his explanations for everything. Why, yes, but they're not very convincing. For instance, the night he tried to throw me overboard on the Kilmorden, he says he followed Rayburn up on deck and Rayburn turned and knocked him down. Now we know that's not true. No, said Suzanne unwillingly. But we only heard the story at second hand from Sir Eustace. If we'd heard it direct from Paget himself, it might have been different. You know how people always get a story a little wrong when they repeat it. I turned the thing over in my mind. No, I said at last, I don't see any way out. Paget's guilty. You can't get away from the fact that he tried to throw me overboard, and everything else fits in. Why are you so persistent in this new idea of yours? Because of his face. His face? But. Yes, I know what you're going to say. It's a sinister face. That's just it. No man with a face like that could be really sinister. It must be a colossal joke on the part of nature. I did not believe much in Suzanne's argument. I know a lot about nature in past ages. If she's got a sense of humor, she doesn't show it much. Suzanne is just the sort of person who would clothe nature with all her own attributes. We passed on to discuss our immediate plans. It was clear to me that I must have some kind of standing. I couldn't go on avoiding explanations forever. The solution of all my difficulties lay ready to my hand, though I didn't think of it for some time. The daily budget. My silence or my speech could no longer affect Harry Rayburn. He was marked down as the man in the brown suit through no fault of mine. I could help him best by seeming to be against him. The colonel and his gang must have no suspicion that there existed any friendly feeling between me and the man they had elected to be the scapegoat of the murder at Marlow. As far as I knew, the woman killed was still unidentified. I would cable to Lord Naseby, suggesting that she was no other than the famous Russian dancer, Nadina, who had been delighting Paris for so long. It seemed incredible to me that she had not been identified already, but when I learnt more of the case long afterwards, I saw how natural it really was. Nadina had never been to England during her successful career in Paris. She was unknown to London audiences. The pictures in the papers of the Marlow victim were so blurred and unrecognizable that it is small wonder no one identified them. And, on the other hand, Nadina had kept her intention of visiting England a profound secret from everyone. The day after the murder, a letter had been received by her manager purporting to be from the dancer, in which she said that she was returning to Russia on urgent private affairs and that he must deal with her broken contract as best he could. All this, of course, I only learned afterwards. With Suzanne's full approval, I sent a long cable from DR. It arrived at a psychological moment. This again, of course, I learnt afterwards. The daily budget was hard up for a sensation. My guess was verified and proved to be correct, and the daily budget had the scoop of its lifetime. Victim of the Millhouse murder identified by our special reporter. And so on. Our reporter makes voyage with the murderer. The man in the brown suit. What he is really like. The main facts were, of course, cabled to the South African papers, but I only read my own lengthy articles at a much later date. I received approval and full instructions by cable at Bulawayo. I was on the staff of the Daily Budget, and I had a private word of congratulation from Lord Nasby himself. I was definitely accredited to hunt down the murderer, and I, and only I, knew that the murderer was not Harry Rayburn. But let the world think that it was he. Best so for the present. Chapter XXIV. We arrived at Bulawayo early on Saturday morning. I was disappointed in the place. It was very hot, and I hated the hotel. Also, Sir Eustace was what I can only describe as thoroughly sulky. I think it was all our wooden animals that annoyed him, especially the big giraffe. It was a colossal giraffe with an impossible neck, a mild eye and a dejected tail. It had character. It had charm. A controversy was already arising as to whom it belonged, me or Suzanne. We had each contributed a tikkie to its purchase. Suzanne advanced the claims of seniority and the married state. I stuck to the position that I had been the first to behold its beauty. In the meantime, I must admit, it occupied a good deal of this three-dimensional space of ours. To carry 49 wooden animals, all of awkward shape, and all of extremely brittle wood, is somewhat of a problem. 2 porters were laden with a bunch of animals each, and one promptly dropped a ravishing group of ostriches and broke their heads off. Warned by this, Suzanne and I carried all we could. Colonel Reyes helped, and I pressed the big giraffe into Sir Eustace's arms. Even the correct Miss Pettigrew did not escape. A large hippopotamus and 2 black warriors fell to her share. I had a feeling Miss Pettigrew didn't like me. Perhaps she fancied I was a bold hussy. Anyway, she avoided me as much as she could. And the funny thing was, her face seemed vaguely familiar to me, though I couldn't quite place it. We reposed ourselves most of the morning, and in the afternoon we drove out to the Matopos to see Rhodes' grave. That is to say, we were to have done so, but at the last moment Sir Eustace backed out. He was very nearly in as bad a temper as the morning we arrived at Cape Town, when he bounced the peaches on the floor and they squashed. Evidently, arriving early in the morning at places is bad for his temperament. He cursed the porters, he cursed the waiters at breakfast, he cursed the whole hotel management. He would doubtless have liked to curse Miss Pettigrew, who hovered around with her pencil and pad, but I don't think even Sir Eustace would have dared to curse Miss Pettigrew. She's just like the efficient secretary in a book. I only rescued our dear giraffe just in time. I feel Sir Eustace would have liked to dash him to the ground. To return to our expedition, after Sir Eustace had backed out, Miss Pettigrew said she would remain at home in case he might want her. And at the very last minute Suzanne sent down a message to say she had a headache. So Colonel Reyes and I drove off alone. He is a strange man. One doesn't notice it so much in a crowd. But when one is alone with him, the sense of his personality seems really almost overpowering. He becomes more taciturn, and yet his silence seems to say more than speech might do. It was so that day that we drove to the Matter Post through the soft yellow-brown scrub. Everything seemed strangely silent, except our car, which I should think was the first Ford ever made by man. The upholstery of it was torn to ribbons and, though I know nothing about engines, even I could guess that all was not as it should be in its interior. By and by the character of the country changed. Great boulders appeared, piled up into fantastic shapes. I felt suddenly that I had got into a primitive era. Just for a moment Neanderthal men seemed quite as real to me as they had to Papa. I turned to Colonel Reyes. There must have been giants once, I said dreamily. And their children were just like children are today. They played with handfuls of pebbles, piling them up and knocking them down, and the more cleverly they balanced them, the better pleased they were. If I were to give a name to this place, I should call it the country of giant children. Perhaps you're nearer the mark than you know, said Colonel Reyes gravely. Simple, primitive, big, that is Africa. I nodded appreciatively. You love it, don't you? I asked. Yes. But to live in it long, well, it makes one what you would call cruel. One comes to hold life and death very lightly. Yes, I said, thinking of Harry Rayburn. He had been like that too. But not cruel to weak things. Opinions differ as to what are and are not weak things, Miss Anne. There was a note of seriousness in his voice which almost startled me. I felt that I knew very little really of this man at my side. I meant children and dogs, I think. I can truthfully say I've never been cruel to children or dogs. So you don't class women as weak things? I considered. No, I don't think I do, though they are, I suppose. That is, they are nowadays. But Papa always said that in the beginning men and women roamed the world together, equal in strength, like lions and tigers. And giraffes, interpolated Colonel Reyes slyly. I laughed. Everyone makes fun of that giraffe. And giraffes. They were nomadic, you see. It wasn't till they settled down in communities and women did one kind of thing and men another that women got weak. And of course, underneath, one is still the same, one feels the same, I mean, and that is why women worship physical strength in men, it's what they once had and have lost. Almost ancestor worship, in fact. Something of the kind. And you really think that's true? That women worship strength, I mean. I think it's quite true, if one's honest. You think you admire moral qualities, but when you fall in love, you revert to the primitive where the physical is all that counts. But I don't think that's the end. If you lived in primitive conditions, it would be all right, but you don't, and so, in the end, the other thing wins after all. It's the things that are apparently conquered that always do win, isn't it? They win in the only way that counts. Like what the Bible says about losing your soul and finding it. In the end, said Colonel Reyes thoughtfully, you fall in love, and you fall out of it. Is that what you mean? Not exactly, but you can put it that way if you like. But I don't think you've ever fallen out of love, Miss Anne. No, I haven't, I admitted frankly. Or fallen in love, either. I did not answer. The car drew up at our destination and brought the conversation to a close. We got out and began the slow ascent to the world's view. Not for the first time, I felt a slight discomfort in Colonel Reyes's company. He veiled his thoughts so well behind those impenetrable black eyes. He frightened me a little. He had always frightened me. I never knew where I stood with him. We climbed in silence till we reached the spot where Rhodes lies guarded by giant boulders. A strange, airy place, far from the haunts of men, that sings a ceaseless paean of rugged beauty. We sat there for some time in silence, then descended once more, but diverging slightly from the path. Sometimes it was a rough scramble, and once we came to a sharp slope or rock that was almost sheer. Colonel Reyes went first, then turned to help me. Better lift you, he said suddenly, and swung me off my feet with a quick gesture. I felt the strength of him as he set me down and released his clasp. A man of iron, with muscles like taut steel. And again, I felt afraid, especially as he did not move aside but stood directly in front of me, staring into my face. What are you really doing here? And Bedingfeld, he said abruptly. I'm a gypsy seeing the world. Yes, that's true enough. The newspaper correspondent is only a pretext. You've not the soul of the journalist. You're out for your own hand, snatching at life. But that's not all. What was he going to make me tell him? I was afraid. I looked him full in the face. My eyes can't keep secrets like his, but they can carry the war into the enemy's country. What are you really doing here, Colonel Reyes? I asked deliberately. For a moment, I thought he wasn't going to answer. He was clearly taken aback, though. At last he spoke, and his words seemed to afford him a grim amusement. Pursuing ambition, he said. Just that, pursuing ambition. You will remember, Miss Bedingfeld, that by that sin fell the angels, etc. They say, I said slowly, that you are really connected with the government, that you are in the Secret Service. Is that true? Was it my fancy, or did he hesitate for a fraction of a second before he answered? I can assure you, Miss Bedingfeld, that I am out here strictly as a private individual traveling for my own pleasure. Thinking the answer over later, it struck me as slightly ambiguous. Perhaps he meant it to be so. We rejoined the car in silence. Halfway back to Bulawayo, we stopped for tea at a somewhat primitive structure at the side of the road. The proprietor was digging in the garden and seemed annoyed at being disturbed. But he graciously promised to see what he could do. After an interminable wait, he brought us some stale cakes and some lukewarm tea. Then he disappeared to his garden again. No sooner had he departed than we were surrounded by cats. 6 of them all meowing piteously at once. The racket was deafening. I offered them some pieces of cake. They devoured them ravenously. I poured all the milk there was into a saucer and they fought each other to get it. Oh, I cried indignantly, they're starved. It's wicked. Please, order some more milk and another plate of cake. Colonel Reyes departed silently to do my bidding. The cats had begun meowing again. He returned with a big jug of milk and the cats finished it all. I got up with determination on my face. I'm going to take those cats home with us. I shan't leave them here. My dear child, don't be absurd. You can't carry 6 cats as well as 50 wooden animals round with you. Never mind the wooden animals. These cats are alive. I shall take them back with me. You will do nothing of the kind. I looked at him resentfully, but he went on, You think me cruel, but one can't go through life sentimentalizing over these things. It's no good standing out, I shan't allow you to take them. It's a primitive country, you know, and I'm stronger than you. I always know when I am beaten. I went down to the car with tears in my eyes. They're probably short of food just today, he explained consolingly. That man's wife has gone into Bulawayo for stores. So it will be all right. And anyway, you know, the world's full of starving cats. Don't, I said fiercely. I'm teaching you to realize life as it is. I'm teaching you to be hard and ruthless like I am. That's the secret of strength and the secret of success. I'd sooner be dead than hard, I said passionately. We got into the car and started off. I pulled myself together again slowly. Suddenly, to my intense astonishment, he took my hand in his. "Anne," he said gently, "I want you. Will you marry me?" I was utterly taken aback. "Oh, no," I stammered. "I can't." "Why not?" "I don't care for you in that way. I've never thought of you like that." "I see. Is that the only reason?" I had to be honest. I owed it him. "No," I said, "it is not. You see, I care for someone else." "I see," he said again. "And was that true at the beginning, when I first saw you, on the Kilmorden?" "No," I whispered. "It was, since then." "I see," he said for the third time, but this time there was a purposeful ring in his voice that made me turn and look at him. His face was grimmer than I had ever seen it. What do you mean?" I faltered. He looked at me, inscrutable, dominating. "Only that I know now what I have to do." His words sent a shiver through me. There was a determination behind them that I did not understand, and it frightened me. We neither of us said any more until we got back to the hotel. I went straight up to Suzanne. She was lying on her bed reading, and did not look in the least as though she had a headache. "Here reposes the perfect gooseberry," she remarked, alias the tactful chaperone. "Why, and dear, what's the matter?" For I had burst into a flood of tears. I told her about the cats. I felt it wasn't fair to tell her about Colonel Ray's. But Suzanne is very sharp. I think she saw that there was something more behind. "You haven't caught a chill, have you, Anne?" "Sounds absurd even to suggest such things in this heat, but you keep on shivering." "It's nothing," I said. "Nerves, or someone walking over my grave. I keep feeling something dreadful's going to happen." "Don't be silly," said Suzanne, with decision. "Let's talk of something interesting. And about those diamonds." "What about them?" "I'm not sure they're safe with me. It was all right before, no one could think they'd be amongst my things. But now that everyone knows we are such friends, you and I'll be under suspicion too." "Nobody knows they're in a roll of films, though," I argued. "It's a splendid hiding place and I really don't think we could better it." She agreed doubtfully, but said we would discuss it again when we got to the falls. Our train went at 9 o'clock. Sir Eustace's temper was still far from good, and Miss Pettigrew looked subdued. Colonel Ray's was completely himself. I felt that I had dreamed the whole conversation on the way back. I slept heavily that night on my hard bunk, struggling with ill-defined, menacing dreams. I awoke with a headache and went out on the observation platform of the car. It was fresh and lovely, and everywhere, as far as one could see, were the undulating wooded hills. I loved it more than any place I had ever seen. I wished then that I could have a little hut somewhere in the heart of the scrub and live there always, always. Just before 2:30, Colonel Ray's called me out from the office and pointed to a bouquet-shaped white mist that hovered over one portion of the bush. "The spray from the falls," he said. "We are nearly there." I was still wrapped in that strange dream feeling of exaltation that had succeeded my troubled night. Very strongly implanted in me was the feeling that I had come home. Home. And yet I had never been here before, or had I in dreams? We walked from the train to the hotel, a big white building closely wired against mosquitoes. There were no roads, no houses. We went out on the stoep and I uttered a gasp. There, half a mile away, facing us, were the falls. I've never seen anything so grand and beautiful, I never shall. Anne, you're fey, said Suzanne, as we sat down to lunch. I've never seen you like this before. She stared at me curiously. Am I? I laughed, but I felt that my laugh was unnatural. It's just that I love it all. It's more than that. A little frown creased her brow, one of apprehension. Yes, I was happy, but beyond that I had the curious feeling that I was waiting for something that would happen soon. I was excited, restless. After tea we strolled out, got on the trolley and were pushed by smiling blacks down the little tracks of rails to the bridge. It was a marvelous sight, the great chasm and the rushing waters below, and the veil of mist and spray in front of us that parted every now and then for one brief minute to show the cataract of water and then closed up again in its impenetrable mystery. That, to my mind, has always been the fascination of the falls, their elusive quality. You always think you're going to see, and you never do. We crossed the bridge and walked slowly on by the path that was marked out with white stone on either side and led round the brink of the gorge. Finally, we arrived in a big clearing where on the left a path led downwards towards the chasm. The Palm Gully, explained Colonel Race. Shall we go down? Or shall we leave it until tomorrow? It will take some time, and it's a good climb up again. We'll leave it until tomorrow, said Sir Eustace with decision. He isn't at all fond of strenuous physical exercise, I have noticed. He led the way back. As we went, we passed a fine native stalking along. Behind him came a woman who seemed to have the entire household belongings piled upon her head. The collection included a frying pan. I never have my camera when I want it, groaned Suzanne. That's an opportunity that will occur often enough, Mrs. Blair, said Colonel Race. So don't lament. We arrived back on the bridge. Shall we go into the rainbow forest? He continued. Or are you afraid of getting wet? Suzanne and I accompanied him. Sir Eustace went back to the hotel. I was rather disappointed in the rainbow forest. There weren't nearly enough rainbows, and we got soaked to the skin, but every now and then we got a glimpse of the falls opposite and realized how enormously wide they are. Oh, dear, dear falls, how I love and worship you and always shall. We got back to the hotel just in time to change for dinner. Sir Eustace seems to have taken a positive antipathy to Colonel Race. Suzanne and I rallied him gently, but didn't get much satisfaction. After dinner, he retired to his sitting room, dragging Miss Pettigrew with him. Suzanne and I talked for a while with Colonel Race, and then she declared, with an immense yawn, that she was going to bed. I didn't want to be left alone with him, so I got up too and went to my room. But I was far too excited to go to sleep. I did not even undress. I lay back in a chair and gave myself up to dreaming. And all the time I was conscious of something coming nearer and nearer. There was a knock at the door and I started. I got up and went to it. A little black boy held out a note. It was addressed to me in a handwriting I did not know. I took it and came back into the room. I stood there holding it. At last I opened it. It was very short. I must see you. I dare not come to the hotel. Will you come to the clearing by the Palm Gully? In memory of cabin 17, please come. The man you knew as Harry Rayburn. My heart beat to suffocation. He was here then. Oh, I had known it all along. I had felt him near me. All unwittingly, I had come to his place of retreat. I wound the scarf round my head and stole to the door. I must be careful. He was hunted down. No one must see me meet him. I stole along to Suzanne's room. She was fast asleep. I could hear her breathing evenly. Sir Eustace? I paused outside the door of his sitting room. Yes, he was dictating to Miss Pettigrew. I could hear her monotonous voice repeating. I therefore venture to suggest that in tackling this problem of colored labor, she paused for him to continue, and I heard him grunt something angrily. I stole on again. Colonel Race's room was empty. I did not see him in the lounge, and he was the man I feared most. Still, I could waste no more time. I slipped quickly out of the hotel and took the path to the bridge. I crossed it and stood there waiting in the shadow. If anyone had followed me, I should see them crossing the bridge. But the minutes passed and no one came. I had not been followed. I turned and took the path to the clearing. I took 6 paces or so and then stopped. Something had rustled behind me. It could not be anyone who had followed me from the hotel. It was someone who was already here, waiting. And immediately, without rhyme or reason, but with the sureness of instinct, I knew that it was I myself who was threatened. It was the same feeling as I had had on the Kilmorden that night, a sure instinct warning me of danger. I looked sharply over my shoulder. Silence. I moved on a pace or two. Again I heard that rustle. Still walking, I looked over my shoulder again. A man's figure came out of the shadow. He saw that I saw him and jumped forward, hard on my track. It was too dark to recognize anybody. All I could see was that he was tall and a European, not a native. I took to my heels and ran. I heard him pounding behind. I ran quicker, keeping my eyes fixed on the white stones that showed me where to step, for there was no moon that night. And suddenly my foot felt nothingness. I heard the man behind me laugh, an evil, sinister laugh. It rang in my ears as I fell headlong, down, down, down to destruction far beneath.